say a few words about our work on historical memory and education, and it is right from the beginning, more or less from its initiation. In 2013, the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum formed the working group Historical Memory and Education. And probably it was a logical thing to do, because we have at least 5 or 4 members organizations that have the word memorial in their name, all of them working together at the working group Historical Memory and Education and leading on remembrance issues in their countries. And also one of the speakers today also representing Memorial International from Moscow. Later in 2015, and I see some of the audiences already know the exhibition Different Wars. So the working group created the exhibition Different Wars, which traveled to 22 cities in the EU and Russia, as well as Belarus. Different Wars is about World War II and how it is depicted in history school textbooks in 6 countries, including Russia. And we also saw in this exhibition that there are different narratives that are prevailing in different countries in perception of World War II. What does it mean to us, and what are the consequences of World War II? Later, this initiative grew into a program, Different Wars, Remembering the Past. Currently, we work with a group of teachers from Poland, Germany, Russia and Belarus to create a set of multi-perspective history lessons about World War II, also in a variety of languages. So our aim and work is working with different narrative about World War II and creating space for discussion and exchange, and see how different narrative can coexist. And it is important that we talk about those different narratives. And even though we might not press it into one transnational view. I'm coming myself from Lithuania, and there's also certain narrative on World War II, which is, I would describe it more or less like the East Central European perception. It was also interesting that one colleague in Poland, with whom we are currently working with history teachers, said that to her and to some Poles, World War II ended actually in 1989. So I found it very interesting and striking. In our work in the forum, we are also working with different audiences. It is an important part of our work, and I'm also in particular glad for diverse audience that has registered and participated today at this discussion, from Ukraine, Russia and Belarus to Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands, and going beyond to the USA, Canada and Singapore. So just to mention a few countries and a few representatives that registered and participate today in this discussion. I am also very much thankful for our faithful followers who are following us since the time of the Different Wars exhibition, so since 4 or 5 years. And finally, we would like also to introduce, in 2020, we shot a short video, Clash of Memories, and I'm also happy that the director of the film, Stefano Di Pietro, also could manage to join this discussion because and introduce or say a few words about this film. He is yet in another exciting project, and he was the whole day on the way to Auschwitz to do some filming of another project. Before I give a word to Stefano, I would like also, after we see the short video, for me, and this video means that it's an invitation to the further and deeper discussion and meaningful discussion, and I hope that that's what we will have today. And here I would like also to invite everyone for active participation and discussion, also the audience, and not only listening to the participation, to participants, to speakers. So I will stop here, and Stefano, if you would like to say a few words, and then Alex, please show us the video, and then I will give the word to our moderator, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it was a. I wasn't sure I could make it, but I'm glad that I'm here, and I'm glad I've been invited to say just a few words. It is so a bit of introduction. We filmed in Berlin, Gdansk, and Moscow to talk about the title of the film at the end. It's which I particularly like is Clash of Memories, which express a bit what we tried to describe very briefly. What could be done and what I tried to achieve in a 10 minutes film is not to give solutions, of course, or not to cover all the discussions, which is not possible, but to provoke a conversation, more with try to play with words, music, and emotions that are, you know, the protagonist of a debate that is quite heated and very crucial. And I hope that this is achieved, that this could lead to further discussions. I learned a lot while filming, while talking with 10 different and very interesting speakers, and some are here and probably will tell us more. And just so I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did filming and working with Christine on this.
Thank you. And Alex? We can think that school textbooks are objective. Actually, we found out that it might be a delusion. It is an exhibition. We are dealing with the topic of World War II and how this topic is depicted in national school textbooks in 6 countries: Italy, Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, Russia, and Lithuania. It shows that the topic is full of conflicts.
The history of the Second World War is, and also of the Nazi times, is becoming actually more and more important in Germany. I think even with the rise of right-wing parties, there is a clash of cultures, or fighting even against commemoration. And how could art represent the crime and the suffering and the mass murder? The memorial was opened in 2005 together with the Information Center. The concept of Peter Eisenman is not linear. On the one hand, he is very much into order. On the other hand, he included elements of disorientation.
In Germany, for the last 60 years, we are focusing on remembering the victims of the fascist dictatorship. In Eastern Europe, there's another view, end of war, but beginning of the Soviet occupation. There are victims, there are violence. Just to understand, for example, the Nazis is not the answer. And if you're strong enough, you have the power to say, okay, there's another perspective. The next step is I'm strong enough to come into a discussion when there are different perspectives.
Естественно, у нас возникает негодование. И различного рода аспекты странами Запада принижаются. Центральный музей Великой Отечественной войны был открыт 9 мая 1995 года. Чтить память тех, кто погиб от их рук, от рук наших противников. В этом моменте, в том числе и в нашем музее, проходят различного рода круглые столы, международные конференции с участием историков, собственно говоря, и из Европы, и из Соединенных Штатов Америки. Если не будет каждая страна и каждая сторона на себя тянуть одеяло, а объективно дадут оценки сейчас роли Советского Союза и другой страны в общем деле победы, тогда, мне кажется, все, конечно, встанет на свои места. Политики Запада не особенно хотят это делать, потому что те факты и те какие-то тезисы, которые мы предоставим со своей стороны, возможно, им будет нечем бить.
Война — это намного более сложно. Видим мы какой-то один слой всей этой картинки. Когда у нас будет сейчас юбилей, это будет на каждом плакате, это будет везде. Великая победа нашей страны. Можно ли что-то говорить, можно ли что-то спорить? Конечно, можно, но лучше выехать из Москвы.
Pamięć o II wojnie światowej w Gdańsku jest bardzo silnie obecna. Myślę tu o zamordowanym w styczniu ubiegłego roku prezydencie Pawle Adamowiczu. On ustanowił sposób upamiętniania 1 września na Westerplatte, w miejscu, gdzie rozpoczęła się II wojna światowa. Pamięć o II wojnie światowej w sposób zdecydowanie słabnie. Najbardziej widoczne jest to, kiedy myślimy o tym, w jaki sposób dzisiaj postrzegana jest Unia Europejska. Twórcy Unii Europejskiej myśleli o odbudowie porządku demokratycznego i unieważnieniu szukania takiego wspólnego mianownika wydaje mi się jedyną tak naprawdę odpowiedzią, jaką dzisiaj Europa rozumiana jako zbiór wartości konkurujących pamięci mogłaby zaoferować przyszłości.
it's the task of historians, task of educators, task of institutions to create stories which would not further the divisions that existed during the Second World War and had existed before the Second World War.
I think we do not need to press everything to a transnational view, but we need to talk about our histories.
It is important to talk about difficult past because it gives a chance for peace, gives a chance for understanding each other better, and it gives a chance for the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much for sharing this video, and Stefano for introducing this and sharing the background on like the motivation to make the video, but also what it did to you, that you actually learned so much. And I can imagine that also the people who've been part of the video, but also did the research on how the Second World War was represented in the history textbooks, actually learned a lot through this topic, because the history of the Second World War, also know from the work of Euroclio and the research we're doing on contested history, is one of the most contested histories still in Europe. So welcome to everybody to join this online discussion. It's great to have so many people of you here. I want to thank the EU-Russia civil society for giving the opportunity to have this discussion on this special day. And also thank the speakers for joining us. So today we have 3 speakers, Alexandra Losinskaya, working for the Memorial International in Russia, and Jörg Moret, was the director of the German-Russian Museum in Berlin-Karlshorst, and Jan Skudelinski was a historian and a former specialist at the Museum of World War II in Gdansk. And it's great that we also have so many people from all across Europe, but also many other countries. And the idea for this session is also to really make it a conversation. So I prepared some questions, also together with my colleagues from the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. And I do suggest that the first one is really meant, it will be the same questions for all the speakers, and it's really meant for them to introduce themselves and their relation to the commemoration of World War II and their professional lives. So up till then, I think we first let the speakers answer the first question. But afterwards, if people would like to take the floor and ask a question, I really want to make that possible. So there is a chat function here in the Zoom. So it's on the bottom. So you can put things in the chat and basically ask questions. Also, our colleagues from the Civil Society Forum will monitor that. But also if you want to speak, because one of the nice things about Zoom and actually is that we all have video, we all have audio, but in those cases, please raise your hand, and that means that you actually would like to have the floor, and I'm happy to give it to you. So without further ado, I actually want to go to the speakers. So let's start with Alexandra. And my question for you, which will be the same for all the speakers, how have you worked on the commemoration of the World War II in your professional life? And what do you think is important to remember from this episode of European and world history?
Thank you for inviting me here. Should I say about myself? I represent Memorial International here, and I am a sociologist, and one of my main field, my main areas of research is sociology of memory. And I will speak today from my experience of working in Memorial International for the competition of school children's historical research, which is to be one of the first individual research made based on the family archive or either local archives, where they try to connect they traces the evidences they found themselves with the bigger, wider historical context. And my personal research recently relates to the commemorative action that have been established lately in Russia, which is called Immortal Regiment, which was the grassroots initiative started by journalists in Tomsk, Siberia. So that was very individual search for commemorative practices. However, this experience was monopolized, appropriated by state, and I traced the way very personal memories of family members experiencing Second World War being utilized for the recent propaganda purposes. So speaking of, coming to your back to your question of what do I believe is important to remember about the event. From what I learned in my country, since we are experiencing a threat of unification of World War II experiences, and as long as we are having legislative initiative established recently, stating that history cannot, I believe that it's important to keep a place for different experiences of memory of war. Keep it in mind that it was a huge event. There were soldiers, there were civil citizens, there were so many areas, there were so many national movements. And I would also say that it's important to see the different agencies, by which I mean, what I've seen in the movie, there were victims mentioned in European context. In Russia recently, the main agent of the action relating to Second World War is a hero, mostly a soldier. However, that could be a person who suffered. Still, there is no place for victims. There is no place for suffering, for conversation about pain, for the simple fact that war is pain. And as we celebrate victory in World War II, we do not talk about grieving. We are mostly celebrating. And I think that's something that should be reflected on in Russia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. So for you, the commemoration is also very personal. It's about like the lived experiences of all the people involved. And I was wondering about what you mentioned, the grassroots initiatives for commemoration in Tomsk. And you said that was appropriated by the state. Can you explain a little bit more about how that works also for the people who are not familiar with it?
It's a story to tell. Technically in 2013, if I'm not wrong, there were journalists in Tomsk who suggested that since all the many soldiers who fought during Second World War, they passed away, and still there's a memory in our hearts about our relatives. They suggested people to come and march through the streets with the portraits of their relatives, which people did. And it was very personal. So you can make your own grandfather walk through the streets, and that was your way of keeping in touch with your family and be in a public place. So it happened for a couple of years. And then since it really, this kind of commemorative action called for received a good reaction, it was suggested to be done on a state level. So it was organized by state. The first march was suggested to have a Red Square. And what my research covers is the interpretative schema of the event. While people brought their very personal experiences and very few personal memories, since, as you can tell, relatives don't usually talk about war. It's one of the main things people say is, my grandparents mostly didn't say anything. And there were very, very few stories. Because what would you say to your grandchild about how you experienced such a danger? So people brought their very personal experiences. However, there was state interpretation of what happened. And this state interpretation happened to be blind to, as I said, all the complexities of the war, all the threats people experienced, fears, losses. It was very much a conversation about people who participated in the war being heroes. And this is one of the main narratives, main messages of Second World War in Russia right now. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. It does give much more context, and it's very interesting to learn about what is happening also in Russia. And what you mentioned about like the complexities of the war, and that it's in Russia basically the main narrative is a simplified narrative focused on soldiers as heroes. Looking back at the video that Stefano directed and that was made, your colleague Nikita also said that we only see part of the picture, it's not complex enough. But I'm coming from an organization that works for history educators, and I know that teachers are also struggling to bring in this complexity because it's so fast. I mean, the Second World War, it was, as you mentioned yourself, so many different countries, so many different players. So what do you think is that needed? How can you bring that complexity in? How do you do that in the work with Memorial?
How do we do it in Memorial? You can see, as Christina mentioned, we had an exhibition that suggested to deal with history notebooks, textbooks, that since the exhibition happened in 2016, we had 12 textbooks to deal with. Since that time, we only have 3 officially state-approved textbooks for kids. So what we do, we suggest that school children who participate in our competition, research competition, we suggest they work with, they start from the very low level, from the level of the evidence, from diaries, documents, letters. We had amazing writings that students wrote just based on the letters from their grandfather to their grandma during the war. And then they can see everyday life, for example. So they can still see that people ate, people were afraid, people were surprised that they saw the world, since the Soviet Union was quite close. And then they also, the chance to see buildings, talk to people. And sometimes even in that papers, soldiers, I'm mostly focused on soldiers, but actually, it's, like I said, it's such a variety of experiences. People, the Soviet citizens, they meet other people and they talk about it. And this is what makes school children shift and see their relatives or the objects of study as very complex and very human creatures, I would say. I don't know how to define it.
I think those are also excellent suggestions and takeaways for indeed history educators who are joining now, to look at the different experiences and look at history through the lens of ordinary people, and to make those stories human. We also know that from our work that it resonates more. Students, they can relate to through the lived experiences. So then it's still a challenge to then find the sources in your archive, I think, that are most appealing. And do you do the selection, or is that something that the teachers do, or the students?
Students do it themselves. We have teachers, we have a great community of school teachers who visit us, whom we discuss the way for students to make their first work. And recently we moved towards maybe suggesting to students not only write their papers, not make the competitive work to be only essay, but they can also move toward art, so they can make movies, some sort of artistic combinations of objects or experiences, evidences. And that's also for them to join, to retell the story the way they grasped it.
Yeah, so then they are also the ones doing the interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much. We'll come back later to have also a discussion, and I would like the speakers also to react to each other, but I suggest we now go to the next speaker. Jörg, I have the same questions for you. Thank you also for joining. How have you worked on the commemoration of World War II in your professional life? And what do you think is important to remember from this episode of European and world history?
First of all, maybe it's worth to mention, I studied history and Russian. And as a student, I was involved in a huge exhibition in Germany about the crimes of the Wehrmachtsausstellung in the 90s. And at that time, when I started my studies, the perspective or the relation to Russia, to the former Soviet Union, were very good, you can say. So I started as a product of perestroika, you can say. And for the last 30 years, it became worse and worse and worse. And then I started my professional life in a memorial site, a former concentration camp, Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin, as a researcher, student, already a postdoc researcher. And I focused on the post-war period and the so-called special camps run by the NKVD, so part of Soviet repression in the East German part. And then I switched over to Karlshorst, to the German-Russian Museum. It's about 11 years ago, become the director of this museum. And Karlshorst is the historical place of the surrender. So 8th of May here in Karlshorst, 45. Here in Karlshorst, the Wehrmacht signed the unconditional surrender. So this was the end of World War II. of course, yeah, it's my professional life to to care for this historical site. And another point, it's really a German-Russian, or became a German-Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian museum. We started as a German-Russian museum 25 years ago, and then the museums from Kiev and Minsk, the museums about World War II, history of World War II, joined our association. And when I started 11 years ago, it was much more easier to come together. And but I noticed already at that time, it will become more difficult because the national perspective in every country becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And in the German perspective, as I said, nearly 30 years ago, I was involved as a student in this topic, the war, German war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. And I already noticed at that time, this is a huge historical question about all this, the crimes done by Germans in not only the Soviet Union, but we were focusing at that time on the Soviet Union. So coming back to this topic as the director of this museum and noticing that, yeah, the other perspective from Russia and nowadays from Belarus and Ukrainian as well, but from Russia, more focusing on this country it's a complete different way. So nowadays, when we have the 75th anniversary, and of course everyone is looking to Karlshorst at the place where the war came to an end, it is nearly impossible to bring together these so different narratives, so different perspectives. Nevertheless, we still exist as a common museum, and this is already a political thing. So this is the last point I want to make. I'm working as an historian, yes, but as a director, sometimes I'm a kind of diplomat. So I'm working in a political sphere, and yeah, it's not so easy. And for us, we were a bit lucky that we had the lockdown by the corona virus because it was very calm here in Karlshorst, and we have time enough to think all the things, and some Zoom conferences, okay, but yeah, it was a big luck for us to have this anniversary in more or less calm times to think about that. So professionally, I'm involved in this topic already 30 years.
That's impressive. And thank you so much for joining. So you can also look at this from like a lot of different angles, actually. And just for the second part of my question, what do you think is important to remember from the Second World War? I mean, you worked for the camps, you've done the memory sites. Of course, it's an important distinction. But now you're also, you as this diplomat function, you also know how politicized history can be. And as a historian, you of course look also at like the historical significance, etc. So what comes to the front? And also looking at history educators, yeah, again, thinking about this limited time, what if we have so many lessons, let's say 4 or 8, how should this time be used?
The main point, Christina already said in the film, is coming together. So that's why I'm glad to be the director of this museum. We are still coming together, and we are coming together. Nevertheless, there are so different perspectives. And the second point, as a professional historian, I would say, yes, we have to talk about the facts, but this is already a philosophical question. What are facts? And but in a professional way, we have to do research, and in common places as museums, as the Civil Society Forum, in exhibitions, in TV, in Zoom conferences, wherever, we have to come together. This is the main point.
Okay, so you see the teaching about this topic, whether it's public history, which of course you also do in the museum, but also what history educators would do in the classroom is really to facilitate dialogue, but still have it evidence-based. So I think that is, those are two like main takeaways. And I'm still intrigued also because I knew that the museum was very special in the sense that it's also like a cooperation between two states, Germany and Russia. I didn't know that Belarus and Ukraine actually also joined this initiative. How very practical, when you make an exhibition, because there's a permanent exhibition, of course, like how do you agree? Because I guess all these states are looking over your shoulder to sort of see how is the Second World War, how is the story presented. So can you give some insights on like the process of creating an exhibition like that?
Yeah, this is a hard question, but I try to answer honest. Yeah, when we renewed our permanent exhibition, this is about 6-7 years ago, it was a process of 4 years. And we have a scientific board here in the museum, and this is a bit special. This board are only German and Russian members, no specialists from Ukraine or Belarus. So this discussion was made for 4 years, only between Germans and Russians. And the next point is we tried to find a consensus, and we did so. Wonderful. But the problem became, and we opened up our new exhibition in 2013. So before the political situation became more conflictful, or how can I say, stronger. And so this kind of exhibition wouldn't be able to do once again nowadays. This is the one point. The second point is, yeah, we did it without specialists from Ukraine and Belarus. It's a pity to confess, but it is like this. And and we found a consensus, yes, but it is, in some points, it's not worth to read this consensus, because it gives no evidence to the different perspectives, and they are so different. So it's more helpful for people, for our visitors to get informed about the different perspectives, maybe in a good sense, that we say, okay, we are working together in this museum, but there are different points of view, and just have a look, and we explain it to you, and it's up to you to decide which is wrong or not wrong, or right. And so searching for consensus, this was the main aim. We did it, but I would say it's old school. It's with a view into the future. We can't go on in this way.
Okay, so then an immediate follow-up question, like if you would now like redesign this, and I appreciate the fact that it would become like much more complex, especially given the political tensions at the moment, where history also plays like an important part of the conflict, making it. But what do you think is the best chance to have an exhibition also, let's say, with historians then also from Ukraine and Belarus on board? Or is it mission impossible?
First of all, this, how can I say this, bureaucratic structures, we have to get in contact with colleagues from Ukraine and Belarus as well. We have these contacts, but I mean in an official way that they will become members of our scientific board. This is the one point. The next point is, yes, we showed the exhibition, different wars here in our museum about 2 years ago, I guess. And yeah, this was very, very helpful for us. And for example, it's a little history. The Russian colleague said, oh, there's only one war, so only one perspective. What does it mean, different wars? Okay, we showed it, and huge success in Berlin, and then we sent the catalog to one colleague in Moscow, working in the National or the Central Museum of the Forces of the Russian Federation. And he saw the book and gave me a call and said, Jörg, it's interesting. We have to show this exhibition here in our museum. They didn't, but nevertheless, he at once understood what was the case, what was the point to do. So in future, this might be a very good approach, maybe on the basis of school books, maybe on the, how can I say, the confirmed research in Germany, in Russia, and Belarus, and Ukraine, and just to show, okay, there are different questions. And the last point is, the German discussion is nearly only focusing on the victims. So, and there's no perspective on the, I would say, roughly the heroes or the actors. So the Red Army defended their own country, and they did it well, and the victory was for the Red Army. So this is, they are not victims. Nevertheless, of course, many millions of prisoners of war became victims of the Nazi dictatorship. And so this, to find a way in this way, how is it possible that in one narrative they are only the heroes and the well-doing people with a happy end, you can say, with victory, and in our perspective only victims, 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 and with the perspective of the look on the German actors, we are, yeah, it's our culture of guilt, you can say. So the German discussion, it's okay. So there's no other way to do it, but we have to keep in mind that our discussion for 70 years, nearly 70 years, is done with the only perspective on the German guilt and to honor the victims of Nazi dictatorship. This is it's a huge, it's very important to do so, but to come together with other national narratives, we have to understand that this is a very special German perspective.
So there is definitely one parallel then between like Germany and Russia, that there's a very strong national narrative. It's very much the opposite. The focus in Russia on the victory of the Soviet Union, and then in Germany it's more about the guilt and the victims. And
yes, and I want to add, for example, the narrative now in Ukraine is focusing on the sovereignty of the national state of Ukraine, which chances existed in World War II, and where were our chances. And this is a completely different narrative and discussion, and it's hard to come together with colleagues from the Ukraine in this point when we are talking about collaboration and so on.
Yeah, so the national stories are very different. And then at the same time, if you look at the individual stories also, then people come from mixed marriages, for example, and then it's even more complex. So in terms of like for good history teaching and critical thinking, it's really a very good topic to dive into. Well, thank you very much for sharing. We will be back. I would now like to move actually to like a third country experience case study, Poland, and now give the floor to Jan Skudelinski, so who is like a historian and former specialist at the Museum of World War II in Gdansk. And how have you worked on the commemoration of the World War II in your professional life, and what do you think is important to remember from this episode of European and world history? So the same question for you, Jan.
Hello. As you said, formerly I worked at the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk. I was working then from 2009 until 2017. And basically that was the beginning of my professional meeting with commemoration of the Second World War, because it was quite a unique project which attempted to merge together various points of view and present Polish perspective on the war by comparing it with others. Hence, this project was supposed to bring together the Western and Eastern perspective on the war, and to bring out the uniqueness of the Central European perspective of the war. It was very difficult from the very beginning because of the complexity of the issue, and of course due to the fact that such a presentation has become a political problem, because some politicians more nationalistically minded have attacked it as being not Polish enough. Let's simplify it as such. So by being in the middle ground between Germany and Russia. We've been attacked. Well, we tried to present something akin to the merger of those perspectives, but we were attacked on a similar way as have been reported from Russia. There were some claims that there is one unique Polish perspective, supposedly decided by the government. And if you read the papers, such perspective in Poland is getting more and more, maybe not following, but more power. Yes, and having said that, and coming to the second part of your question, when it comes to what is supposed to be remembered from the Second World War, I will start with the Central European perspective, which is in this way that there was not only one invader, but two of them. First being Nazi Germany that invaded Poland, and second was Soviet Union that invaded Poland, and then Baltic states and parts of Romania, and then, of course, Finland. And since there were two invaders, there were two occupations, two different methods of persecuting people, and that those two big dictators, Stalin and Hitler, cooperated by means of the international treaty known as Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Second point that I think is important, apart of course from the fact that Second World War had been the most terrible conflict in the history of mankind, and that it's covered the entire world, and it affected people in countries that haven't even participated in the Second World War. Second thing that is important, I think, is to remember how quickly the world fallen into this conflict, how seemingly peaceful world has collapsed in a few short years, and how easy it is to forget that the life of people could change overnight virtually from peaceful work to world conflict.
So there is a very important lesson to learn from the Second World War, that like peace and democracy should not be taken for granted, and that it can be easy to fall into, well, in this case, dictatorship, totalitarian regimes.
One more thing, maybe. I believe that many of those who have started the war and fought it and committed crimes believed honestly that they are doing a moral and right thing. So it's important to always scrutinize what you are for, and always scrutinize what means do you believe are justifiable to achieve that goal.
I would like to ask a little bit more about your experience working for the museum, if I may, because you described that there were politicians who were very nationalistically minded and said it was not being Polish enough. And I know that the director was also changed, and that also led to changes in the exhibition. Yes. So for people who are not so familiar with that, can you explain how that changed? What was would that be reflected in the mission? What changed after the directors, essentially? If you would go as a visitor to the museum before, and then as it is now.
Okay. Well, the museum had been started as a Polish take on the history of the Second World War, and was the direct result of the Polish-German debate of early 2000s, namely the debate about the expulsions of Germans from Poland after the Second World War, which led to pointing out from the Polish side that the whole story of expulsions of Germans after the Second World War is not really clear and fully understandable without showing the context of what had happened before. For example, that the war in Poland was much more brutal and cruel from the very beginning than the war in the West, that the Germans have conducted ethnic cleansing on the lands that they had occupied, and that the German occupation of Poland was terrible and brutal. And more than that, basically, that the 1944-1945, as opposed to the Western countries, did not lead to liberation, or maybe did not lead to liberty, because Poland was, and other Central European countries were certainly liberated from Nazi Germany, but they did not ended up as free and democratic countries. And hence this date 1989 that has been mentioned today is sometimes treated as the date where all consequences of the Second World War were finally overcome, and that the freedom and democracy and liberalism finally appeared in Central and Eastern Europe, which is the unique perspective of Central Europe. This whole project started as an attempt, as I said, to show Polish perspective and history of Poland during the war in comparison to perspectives of other countries. Because we firmly believe, or Professor Machcewicz, who was the creator of the museum and one of the co-author of the main programs, and he was personally responsible for the shape of the museum, believed, and I believe justly, that it's not enough to say, for example, that, it's not convincing to declare something. It's way better to show things in perspective and then let the visitors and those who receive the message of the museum to draw their own conclusions about it. So this international perspective was always present, and the museum, to allow for the taking into consideration various points of view, from the beginning had an international advisory board, which had been composed of leading Polish historians of the Second World War and historians from the main participants of the Second World War, namely Germany, Russia, Great Britain, France, and the United States, and of course a historian from Israel, because of course the Holocaust and mass murder of Jews is an all-important issue during the Second World War, and we believe that a historian from Israel, despite the country not being participant of the Second World War and not even existing during the Second World War, this perspective is also important. This had led to accusations in nationalistic press and from nationalistic historians that the museum is supposed either to present the some kind of multicultural leftist perspective, which doesn't really give justice to Polish point of view on the war. I'm using the term Polish point of view, but in this context, it means that the belief of certain right-wing people what the Polish point of view should be. Secondly, there had been even accusations that those who are creating the museums are really working under the supervision of Germany, and one quotation from a leading Polish politician was that this is a Donald Tusk's gift to Angela Merkel, which seems funny, but believe me, it isn't when you are working in the midst of it. After the election in 2016, the new government tried to do everything they could to replace Professor Machcewicz and take over the museum before the exhibition was opened. And Professor Machcewicz waged a court battle against it. Thankfully, we did manage to open the museum in March 2017 and allow visitors in to see the unaltered part of the exhibition. And 2 weeks later, the museum was taken over by the new director. All the directors were sacked. The International Advisory Board was disbanded. And nowadays, the advisory board is composed only of Polish historians, and those being rather historians who have been known of their nationalistic point of view. The whole operation of the museum has almost doesn't have any international outlook at all. Everything that is happening is concentrating on Poland only, and changes in the exhibition had been introduced. The most glaring ones was the replacing of the film that ended the original exhibition. The original film, which is available in the internet, of course not officially on the websites of the museum, showed how the world after the Second World War was divided until 1989, how wars affected the world afterwards, and how recent years, because we led this movie as far as the conflict in Ukraine and Donbass, how people are still suffering due to wars and conflicts. The film has been replaced with an animated film called The Unconquered, in Polish Niezwyciężeni. It is also available on the internet, which shows basically how Poland was a country that had been invaded by two invaders and how Poles were either suffering and being killed or were heroically fighting for their freedom. There is no place for any ambiguities nor any Poles and Polish people are treated as a single heroic nation. The second glaring change in the exhibition, which I feel is the most damaging to the exhibition itself, is to present Ulma family, a Polish family from southeastern Poland, who were murdered by the Germans for hiding a Jewish family. The parents and their 6 children were killed for hiding a Jewish family. And this is presented under the caption Poles, how it would be in English, a Polish reaction to the Holocaust. And it suggests as if the only thing that Poles did as when Holocaust happened was to help the Jews, which I think shows what is the attempt being made by the current leadership of the museum, is simply to overlook or simply hide the fact that not always Poles were heroes or victims, that quite often it did happen that well, the history of war is much more complicated than that, and such simplistic and false perspective should not be present in the museum, and yet it is being promoted by various ways.
Well, thank you very much for sharing those unique insights. It's we actually happen to have had our annual conference in Gdansk, and we also visited the museum. And during our plenary session, we actually showed also the video. And one of the suggestions for educational activities would actually be for students to compare and contrast the final videos of the exhibition and to see what changed.
That's an interesting thing to do, really.
Yeah. So I think the third question that I had, and that's for all the speakers, but perhaps Jan, you can answer first. You painted the picture of how the Second World War is remembered in your country, and at the moment, and you explained also some efforts of the government to sort of impose this narrative, the museum being one of them. But we also know that there are new memory laws that actually set rules of what can be said and what cannot be said. So who actually determines how the Second World War is remembered, and how successful is the state then also of getting that narrative across? Because I mean, you obviously have your own perspective, but you're a professional historian. What about ordinary citizens, people who didn't study history? Where do they get their information from, and how dominant is this narrative amongst the general population?
Well, it's of course naturally a very complicated question, and my answer to it will also be my particular point of view on it, which might not be true. But bearing that in mind, I might say that first of all, what needs to be remembered that as opposed, I think, to most of Western liberal world that had the pleasure or the lack of living in a free democratic countries for over three generations now, since 1945. First thing that is important is that it was not it had not been possible to freely discuss historical topics up until 1989 in this world, because there was an official state censorship, and Soviet Union was sacrosanct. Soviet Union had been treated only as a liberator and the great ally that helped us to overcome Nazi Germany. The official narrative of victory was also present, not to mention that the official ceremonies of the liberation was not on 8th of May, but 9th of May to match the commemoration in Moscow. And of course, the whole issue of German Soviet-Nazi cooperation from 1939 until 1941, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the expulsions of Poles, the Katyn massacre of Polish officers, and all those topics had been completely banned from official discourse. This created a situation in which for 30 years now, new things are being discovered about history. For example, one of the latest and most gruesome things is the so-called Polish operation of NKVD, which was the targeting of Polish minority in the Soviet Union during the Great Purge in Soviet Union, and over 100,000 Poles fell victim to that, because before the Great Purge there was certain level of Polish institution in Soviet Union, and these had been targeted by Stalin in his campaign to eradicate all people that were deemed to be opposed to him. Well, that's a different story, but the mechanism is the same. This created a situation where history is much more present in day-to-day discourse than it is in the West, I believe, which means that history is being also used as some kind of weapon in day-to-day political life. So it might happen that you will find historical arguments in everyday political discussion. And well, the last iteration of that was the whole problem of Westerplatte Peninsula, where traditionally the ceremonies of the beginning of the Second World War were taking place. And nowadays the whole area has been taken over by the government, and the city authorities, which had organized those events for many years, have now been expelled from it, and the government took it over. And well, for the common people, I think it's that people have an emotional attitude towards historical facts and are very keen to react emotionally to various things that are being uncovered. Because apart from Polish victimhood, which is being uncovered, as I said, the Polish operation, there is an ongoing discussion about those Poles who have been involved in various ways in the Holocaust of the Jews. This is the most glaring example. And many people here who have never heard about it and are now being convinced by politicians that this is an attempt to exonerate Nazi Germany or Germans from the guilt, and an attempt to shift the blame. It has proved to be quite effective because, as I said, the scale of Polish complicity is now being just uncovered by historians. And from experience, I might say that it takes many years, if not decades, for new historical findings to find their way to day-to-day teaching or to day-to-day understanding of the people. So this emotional response makes history a very good fuel for political debates, and we are living in the consequences of it. And the Museum of the Second World War, I believe, fell victim to that, because I do believe that in various Western countries, people are more interested in their everyday lives and job creation than in the exhibitions in historical museums.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I have two quick follow-up questions before going to the other speakers. One is about the last remark that you made, that it takes some time for new historical findings to find its way in public discourse, to find its way in classrooms, history classrooms. So is there the new memory laws? I mean, I heard that basically it's no longer possible to say that indeed there were some Poles who had perhaps more who were to blame, who committed atrocities, that there were also Poles amongst the perpetrators in the Second World War. But if there are new historical findings, is it possible for historians to come out to share their research, or is that really no longer possible? That's one question. And the other is a very practical question from one of the participants. And could you share the name of the original film for the Second World War Museum so that it can be found online?
Okay, the first question would be that there has been an attempt to introduce such memory laws into Polish law. This is the infamous Holocaust law. There was a huge outrage 2 years back where the government had proposed, or maybe not the government, had proposed a law that would simply make it punishable to say that Poles were in any way complicit in the Holocaust. The outrage was obvious because, well, all the historians who commented on that named that the result of such an attempt will be entirely counterproductive to what those who created this proposal were aiming to do, because the aim was to show that Poland was a victim of the war, and blaming Poland for what happened during the Second World War is, or by blaming Poles, is not relevant, because all that was instigated by Nazi Germany, in that in any country there are some people who would collaborate, but still the majority of Poles were heroes or victims. The law itself had a caveat that said that if somebody is a historian and writes a scientific paper, he or she may not be persecuted. So that's the one flaw. This law has been not introduced. There was some agreement between Polish government and the right-wing government of Israel in this respect, and this law is defunct and does not exist. However, the government is doing all it can to take over all the major institutions that are involved in sharing memory. And of course, the government is writing the official curriculum for historians so that history of Poland would remain heroic. And I have to point out that as far as I remember from my education, and as far as I know from ongoing discussion, this issue of Polish complicity has not yet been fully introduced into the curriculum of Polish schools, and had not been introduced into the curriculum of Polish schools before 2015. The Jedwabne debate, the most famous massacre of Jews by their Polish neighbors, has taken place only 20 years ago. And I would say, and dare to say, that it's not yet enough, not long enough for people to absorb it and use it. And secondly, what has to be remembered is that Jedwabne massacre did happen after a period of Soviet occupation, which was brutal and which led to liquidation of all the vestiges of the Polish state, all Polish authority. It all had been taken over by the Soviets, and the brutal regime that was introduced by the Soviets also did play a part in dissolving the social binds between the people and creating this area of lawlessness which made such events possible. So it's a complicated issue, and as I said, it must take time before such thing is being absorbed and perhaps prepared for the history books, because, well, historians debate in complicated issues and are able to discuss at length, whereas a school lesson about the Second World War, although important, it still is one of the very many topics that happen when people are learning history. So it has, by necessity, it has to be very short, brief, and selective. And when it comes to link to the film, I will attempt to find it, and then I will post it in the chat here, but I would require some time to do it. Possibly I will be able to.
Okay, you can do that at your convenience, and we'll also can later share that perhaps via the Facebook groups. No. I just had like one of the participants, Joanna Woydon, she raised her hand, so I want to keep my promise and also give the floor to some of the participants. So, Joanna.
Hello. I was very surprised and happy to listen what Dr. Skudlinski has said about his vision that the Polish debates on the World War II were postponed due to those limitations of the censorship under communism. I have just submitted a chapter to the book on teaching history education on World War II or on war as such, with exactly the same thesis, that due to this postponement, the debate is so heated. And one of my arguments was also that that history education under communism played a very significant role in shaping the Polish collective memory of the Second World War. However, my other conclusions are not so optimistic regarding the contemporary education, and there is research done by Robert Szuchta on teaching and Piotr Trojański on teaching about the Holocaust, and they are very pessimistic. I mean, they criticize the attitude of the Polish education towards the Holocaust in the 1990s, and they developed a program to overcome it, their own curriculum. But now they say that they can observe like the backward movement with this narrative of the Poles, either of heroes or of the victims, but not as bystanders or as, not to mention the perpetrators. And I'm working now as a consultant in a project of e-teaching materials for teaching history in Poland. And we have a very big problem in we are struggling with the lesson on the Holocaust because the peer reviewers who are active teachers do not want such a lesson that starts with the Jedwabne massacre, or generally that does not start from the statement that for the most part, the Poles were saving the Jews and that they were righteous among nations. And it's an important issue, this way of thinking of the teachers themselves, that they don't want multi-perspectivity. And there was a book published recently by Krzysztof Jaskółowski, and he did some research on the attitudes of the Polish teachers and their vision of the goals of history education. And he found out that they are very much proud of instilling patriotism, so national pride, and that they regard the Polish history as a continuum, so using like us in the past, even back in the Middle Ages, it's very strong. So perhaps we should start from working with the teachers before having any hope of changing students or changing pupils' minds. And another thing is that this vision of history as memory in school education also seems to be much stronger nowadays than it was like 20 years ago. But I think, well, you can blame, of course, the new government for that, but I think it's really welcomed by the teachers who don't want to discuss those complexities, multiple perspectives, and so on. They really, that's what Dr. Skudlinski said, that they really want to have, very short, very clear message to convey during the lessons. And that's also what my students told me who are during their teacher training, that they don't want to finish the lesson with an open ending. They want to have a clear message for their pupils. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you much for sharing that, and also indicating like how these discussions about a possible responsibility of some people from Poland for like the Holocaust, how that's also perceived by the teachers, and and thanks for bringing in the student voice. That is also very important. We hear that a lot. That is that sometimes presenting these different interpretations can also be confusing. I mean, of course, coming from Euroclio, who are like promoting innovative and responsible history education, we do think that students in the end should be able to draw their own conclusions, and we try to equip them with all the tools, the knowledge to do that. But there is, of course, it can be difficult, and very often they say, but now teacher, tell us what is the right answer. And it also deals very often with the way examinations is working. So we've seen like a lot of complexity again, but also like the real difficult issues seem to be about assigning blame, assigning guilt, talking about victimhood, talking about perpetrators. I would like to actually go back to the first speaker, to Alexandra, because you are also working on education, and like, what do you think are then like the main aims? What are the implications of these strong narratives? And did you also encounter that in your own work with the students?
You put focus on your question, because I have few directions to go to. What would be your main?
I think the main question is, if these narratives are so dominant, how do you deal with that? And did you experience that in your own work with students? How do these narratives affect them? And should anything be done about it? Like, what is your experience and perspective?
Okay, I will answer your question. I just figured out what bothered me with focusing on your question firsthand. It was just, I think I had questions to both Joanna and Jan, because I could relate so much to what you talked about, unfortunately. And I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, Steven, I couldn't.
Fine. That's fine, it's a discussion. It's not like an interview, so please.
That, how would you explain this search and keenness of teachers and some part of society for greatness and pride related to the results of Second World War? I have my explanation regarding Russia. One of the hypotheses goes as this need for greatness. It's not exactly about Second World War, but it's about the other stage of remembering, and explain what I mean. Since there are few generations, recently ones who are that members of a population who are active and remember Second World War are mostly grandchildren or great-grandchildren of people who really experienced Second World War. So it recently looks like we are dealing not exactly with memory about Second World War, but with memory about how Second World War was commemorated by our parents, which was very much Soviet focus on greatness and victory. So, and this is how I explained for myself this need for pride, not exactly the search for facts or interpretations of complexities, but just this general need for pride, since that was the way your parents celebrated it, commemorated it. I hope it's clear. Would you say it's kind of what you experience in your country? If it's not clear, that's where I can.
Joanna, you would like to react?
If I may, of course, well, maybe not of course, but it's not based on very thorough research, but my impression from the talk with my students was a bit different. History students and then history teachers usually come or are recruited from the people who were very good history pupils themselves. So they inferred what they were taught at school and they like incorporated it, and they really believed, you know, they were good pupils, and then they want to transfer what they got from school themselves. For them, it's no, well, I really had a problem explaining to them that, like, for example, memorizing dates, it's not fascinating for the pupils, because for them it was. because they liked it. They enjoyed like reading 20 pages per lesson and so on and so on. So I think this kind of thing also may have an influence. And what I was also writing in the article that I mentioned is that like just adding the Soviet Union as the perpetrators, or like mentioning Katyn, let's say, or changing labels is not enough to change the general narrative of the World War II. And that's what has been done for the most part in the Polish textbooks. I did another research on the representation of the emigration from Poland in the 19th century in the communist textbooks and in today's textbooks. And the differences are really very tiny. So the general scheme that emigration was wrong and that it was suffering and that it was a loss to the country, it didn't change at all, you know, during the past 30 years. So I think this might be the problem.
Okay, thank you. Jan,
Jörg, you would like to respond as well, please do.
Yeah, I would say it's a part of nation building. So looking for prideness, for the good things in history, for the victory, whatever. It's important in political sense nowadays for the society. And as I notice in the countries of our colleagues from the museum, it's in Russia and in Ukraine, maybe it's coming up now in Belarus. It's so important to build a new society, a new nation, to overcome all these old idols, you can say. For example, you talked about history, teaching history in communistic, in former times, in socialistic times. Yeah, it's 30 years ago. So for the new generation, it's history as well. But of course, it's still working, these old topics. And another point is to maybe to create new idols. As Jan pointed out, when the colleagues in Danzig, when Pavel Marchewicz was the director, started, they tried to get in contact with all the colleagues in Europe, worldwide, you can say. Now they stopped this process because in a political sense, it's more important to do this discussion with your own researchers, with your own people, because you're focusing on your own country. So in American words, to make Poland great, make Russia great, make Ukraine great.
Problem is, I believe that in the way the Second World War is remembered, such attempts to create this heroic vision of history, especially within the European Union, I firmly believe it's absolutely counterproductive. Because it creates an impression that history is being falsified for the reason of building some kind of feelings of greatness. Whereas it's by either omitting or falsifying those things that were perhaps not very the reason of being proud of, it simply makes all the other statements not really acceptable or not really believable. But this counterproductivity is somehow working to convince people that those politicians who say that, well, they accuse us of causing the Holocaust and they call us anti-Semites, so we will oppose them and we will show them, and we are those who protect you from those accusations. It simply gives them support of those people who, having been educated in heroic vision of history, because, well, first Soviet way or communist way of presenting history was either heroism or victimhood. And secondly, even the political or intellectual opposition to communism was rather focusing on those topics that were overlooked, which were also incidentally heroic or stories of victimhood. So this narrative, which shows complex image of the war, has been the domain of intellectuals, but not really came into larger discourse. I would say that this way of presenting history is not something that we will see in academic discussion, but I would call it privately football historics. So there is our team, and we are cheering our team to win, and everybody who says that our team has done something wrong is not really welcome on our in our group of football fans. So it's simplistic, but unfortunately it seems to be working. And as Joanna said, teachers are also taken from the people from good history students and from those who probably were educated in during the communist years, when the so-called true history was suppressed by the official state censorship, and the true history was the full story of Polish victimhood and the full story of Polish heroism. There was not really much room for the complexities and for nuances and for the facts that some people could be victims and perpetrators at the same time. Thirdly, I might say, as I said, that Western world seems to have lived for over 3 generations in the conditions of free speech and democracy, whereas we've had only now 30 years of such an experience. And that's not really long enough for it to work. Sorry. So maybe when we in Central Europe, we in Poland will have had 60 or 70 years of unfettered discussion, maybe this shifting between complexities and heroism, victimhood and heroism, and critical view of the world will balance itself out, provided, of course, the world doesn't fall into some madness again.
I would like to follow up on this dimension of time, because you said like a lot of time has passed since, of course, the end of the Second World War. At the moment today, 75 years. So there are also fewer and fewer people who have the lived experience. At the same time, society has changed a lot. So because of globalization and migration, you also see that people have like different historical backgrounds. It's not so much that it aligns with the national narratives. And one of the participants also had a question about how the memory of war is affected by that, about people who have different backgrounds, but also the people who don't fit the typical narrative. So for example, what about the people who have a background with Soviet Jewish migration to Germany? So in a way, they're not the majority. What place is there for like these little individual stories? I know, Alexandra, when you work with the archive, you must come across several of those stories. How do you work with those?
I think we delineated 2 areas here in this conversation. One relates to academia and the way that researchers deal with experiences, and the other one goes for the general public. So regarding this question and your previous question that I did not allow myself to answer, forgive me, it's actually quite sad, but until there's some identity of a group, until members of a certain group work with themselves and be able and decide to speak from the group experience. Yes, these experiences, they do not fit, they are not heard, they're not even actively, sometimes it's possible that experiences can be actively silenced, as we talked about it. But generally, yes, there's dominant discourse in my country, and it's very hard to overcome it. It's very hard to speak of nuances, intonations, paradoxes, and so on. There's just big, unrewritable narrative about victory with a focus on victory in Second World War, unfortunately. I wish I could give you the happier answer, but
no, I do have an interesting question now for Jörg, because in Germany the discourse is quite different. You mentioned that in the beginning, that the focus is so much on the victims. How does it then work if you go against the grain of the dominant narrative in Germany? You would, for example, point out that not all Germans were bad, and there were some heroes, people who did very good things. What are the reactions to people who would like to nuance the story of victimhood in Germany? Is there room for that? How's the situation?
My answer is a bit in another direction. For example, our shock nowadays is the refreshment of the neo-Nazis, of the young Nazis, and all the museums and teachers and so on, they are wondering. So we spoke about Nazi dictatorship and victims, and we have memorial sites and so on and so on. And now there are many people in our society who won't care about that. They say more or less, it's not true, show us the facts, it's kind of lie what we're saying. So it's kind of shock. So good pedagogic work, you can say, for 50, 60 years, and now as a result, we have a huge problem with neo-Nazis in Germany. So this is the one point. And for example, sometimes I said as a director of my museum, so we are a military museum. Oh, this is not so, they don't like it in Germany if you say, so we are talking about military history. In other countries, this is another point. For example, remembering World War II. In Germany, it's already the time 33 to 45, remembering Nazi dictatorship. And World War II is part of this period, but not the only period. So in your countries, most of participants in your countries, it's a focus on World War II. So starting with, Christina's question, 37, 38, 39, whatever, or 41. And the focus is on military history. Of course, every all other questions are involved in this point of view. And so this is maybe some new, how can I say, this is a bit against the mainstream when you're focusing on military history, because we are still coping with our Wehrmacht, with our soldiers. This is another point I want to make. Normally, if a soldier dies for his country, he's a hero, he's a good work, he's a good man. So what to do with our German soldiers in World War II? In a familiar sense, of course, it's my grandpa and so on, and he can't be a murderer. But this is only in the families. In the society, we had these huge discussions 20, 30 years ago. So the whole Wehrmacht, every soldier of the Wehrmacht was a murderer. So they are it's a kind of stigma. So this is a very special German. I won't bring it back to our society discussing now about only military history and say, oh yes, the German soldiers were good guys. No, they were not, of course. This is a bit problematic in nowadays. But most of all, our main problem at the moment is the shock that our good pedagogics for the last 50 years doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a depressing conclusion. Of course, the neo-Nazis are luckily still a minority, but it is shocking to see that in a country like Germany, that actually the movement is this big. So I do agree that it's a failure also of the educational system. And do you, perhaps to go back then also to the public discourse, because perhaps it's also not fair to put it only on the educators, because have people then, how open and public has been the debate about the memory of the Second World War?
In Germany?
Yeah.
I would say it's open.
It's open.
For example, the freedom of research is given. I think it's a good research scene, and it's possible. The archives are open. So everyone can do his research and write his books, and it's okay. There's no any state repression or any laws against falsifications or lies about history or whatever. So in this way, it's really it's an open discussion and a fruitful discussion, I would say.
And where do you then think that these? How do you explain that these groups are there? I mean, some people say, for example, like that, when it's about social media, for example, we had one interesting example where we have one case study on Historiana, which is our educational portal, and it was a case study on the Sudeten Germans, the expulsion of ethnic Germans from Sudetenland. And we had one activity about a woman who was, there was an image, and she was basically, it looked as if she was crying, but then she was actually also giving like the Nazi sign. And we had a cropped version of that image. And it was taken later, if you would see the full image, it was clear that actually she was making the Nazi sign, because people next to her were also doing this. And the tears of actually the soldiers arriving, those were not tears of despair, they were tears of joy. And later, the cropped image was used by a neo-Nazi website to say, well, look how history is being manipulated. But it was taken completely out of context, because it didn't mention the fact that we had these questions. Look at the next slide where you can see the full picture and how your perspective of the picture changes. So there's a lot of things happening also online that is out of your control. So I don't know what the ratio is of people who actually use the case study in the proper way, and also what the reach has been of this other website that actually, completely took everything out of context. So how should we deal with these difficult paths? Because I know it's the same with if there is for example, one of the image from Buchenwald has also been taken completely out of context. We say, here there are two scientific websites who are having some slightly different interpretations, and therefore they can't both be right. It must all be wrong. And it's as a trained historian, you know why, like where it's going wrong. You can't sort of conclude, therefore, that everything about the Holocaust, for example, is that is not true. But nevertheless, there are these groups who are quite convinced by these arguments. So what can we do? We have these dominant narratives. We've seen they're quite. We've seen that in the case, especially what you shared from Russia, but also in Poland. How should we deal with the difficult past? Do you have any? Because I would also like to note, and perhaps on a positive note, and see, okay, what can we do? We have a community of history educators here, civil society activists. Can you give some recommendations and give us a little bit of hope? So Jan, can you start?
Well, very quickly, I'll first start that, well, we as historians have a problem that people don't believe us. And I think that the fact that people don't believe history might be damaging or difficult, but not as damaging as, for example, those who do not believe doctors and believe vaccinations are evil and 5G is evil and so on and so forth. It seems that the position of experts has diminished in this new world. So what can we do? Maybe we will have to find a new way of getting to people and convincing them. But certainly it's not enough to organize some kind of online expressions of outrage, but the way to convince people is to reason with them and going with them with respect even if they are saying complete nonsense at the beginning. So we need to be patient, and we need to do our jobs and do it as best as we can, to keep it brief. Well, I want to keep my speech brief now.
Okay, thank you. So, Jörg, what would your response be?
Jan is totally right. So we have to focus on the historical context. This is in opposite to these short messages in the social media. This is the first thing, and there are no alternative facts. So so we have to fight against these how can I say, construction of alternative facts. And the last thing is we have to keep in mind that there are always, when you are talking about history, there are always emotions. So as an academic historian, I would say, oh, emotions, don't think about that. But as a man working in a museum, so the emotion side is so important, and maybe this is a way out to cope with these emotions and to not to argue with the emotions, but to keep in mind that they exist, they are real, and we don't. It's a mistake to ignore them.
Thank you, Alexandra.
I would suggest, not to suggest it to be a recipe, but I would suggest to keep in mind just what I began with this discussion. I would suggest that reaching your family experiences, reaching your personal experience, the close one experiences, can be kind of reality check for history interpretations. What I mean is, while you know the evidences, but when you get back to the very first stage of your historical research, you can start from the very beginning and not to focus on the interpretations that's been given to you by public discourse. Not a recipe, a suggestion.
No, but some very important like key ingredients. So since we have a little bit of time, I think one final question from the audience before I give the word back to Christina is a question from Vladislav to tell how the social memory of World War II is changing in European countries. The social memory. It's a big question. It's also for all European countries. So it could be hard to answer, but I want to give it a shot. Yeah, Jan?
Well, the few things I might say is that, well, first, history has become much more popular, at least in Poland, than it had been in 1990s, just after the end of communism. Secondly, I do believe that with the ongoing discussion about the monuments of those who were creators of colonial war, for example, we see the surge of history of those who were not members. I might say something which always struck me when I had the privilege of visiting Western historical conferences in the West. In all those big cities I've been to, the population was mixed. There were people of different origins there. Whereas on conference of historians, it usually happened that there were no representatives of those new minorities, which means that history of Europe has still been, even in recent years, pretty much concentrated on the experiences of those who were not of immigrant origin. And one of my visits was to in Flanders Fields Museum, when there was a huge exhibition, for example, on paid workers brought to Belgium from China to work on building the roads and maintaining the military on the Western Front, which shows that this perspective of those of different backgrounds, different origins is now taking place, its rightful place in the European discourse. It doesn't happen, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, because traditionally Central and Eastern Europe have been the countries from where people emigrate from, not places where people emigrate to. It's now changing, so maybe we will see the such change also in Poland. But as I said in the beginning, it's a very complex and difficult issue, and we are now seeing the change. So maybe the results and the answer could be fully given in 10 to 20 years' time.
Jörg?
Yeah, I would say history is still alive more than 10, 15 years ago. And as an argument, you can notice that it's became a subject of an object, yes, an object of politics. So history is a quite modern science, and the popular things are books and exhibitions and TV films and so on. The popular history is a tool of modern societies. So history is still alive, and this is a chance and a challenge for us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything. I certainly enjoyed the discussion, and I think because there's still so many people here, others people have, and some people had to leave, but they did thank us for the discussion. So also Sergey and Christina, thank you very much for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to moderate the session. Thank you very much for all the speakers for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge. Christina, I would like to give the word back to you to also explain where people can find out more information if they're interested to follow more of these discussions in the future.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, for moderating it. And I just think that Alexandra wanted to say something because she was holding her hand and she was the last one who didn't say the last words. So if I may give her a word.
Thank you, Christina. It was briefly, I had a comment on the question regarding social memory and the way it changes. I just wanted to say that generally we have dominating state discourse, but there are local initiatives all over the country, and we just don't have a chance to grasp that. Very brief comment.
Okay, so I also, it's already almost 7 o'clock, and I see that the discussion was very interesting, and I also enjoyed very much, and I saw that the audience was also patient until the end, stayed with us, and I see that there is a big interest in history, and this is important, as I said in the beginning, to discuss about our national point of view, about our points of references in history, and because nowadays conflicts are very much also based in history and historical conflicts and all these different narratives that we have. So I would like just to thank all the speakers briefly, and Jörg and Jan and Alexandra, and I very much was happy that you found this time to join this discussion. And also for participation of all the audience that we had from all over the world, and also the active participation. It was very great that you also took part in all of in this discussion also actively. I just put then the Facebook link of our program, or of our historical memory work and education work of the forum in the chat, so you can follow us, and you can also take part in other activities, initiatives, and that we would have in the future. I would like to thank Stefano Di Pietro, who just also joined us and who made this short film, and because I know that you are very busy, and now you were on the road to Auschwitz, and I hope that you arrived well to Auschwitz. and our team members in Secretariat who also helped. Without them, it would not be possible to have this discussion. And it's Sergei Tereshenkov and Daria Bykova and Alexandra Keller. Thank you very much. And of course, our partners and the first partnership, which was very successful with Euroclear. It's very great that you also took part in this initiative. And I hope that we will have some future cooperations as well. So